Good day, class, and welcome to the Law on Obligations, Chapter 1. So, Chapter 1 talks about the general provisions of the Law on Obligations. So, there is a statutory definition of an obligation. It is found in Article 1156 of the Civil Code of the Philippines. So, an obligation is a juridical necessity to give, to do, or not to do. All right, so we will tackle this one by one. It seems like a very simple provision. It actually is, but there is more than meets the eye, right? So we have to discuss this one by one. So it mentions that it is a juridical necessity. What is a juridical necessity? Juridical necessity means in case of non-compliance, courts of justice may be called upon for its fulfillment. All right? That means kapag hindi mo ginawa yung obligation mo, pwede ka kasuhan sa korte. That's why it's called a juridical necessity. Because if you fail to perform your obligation, you can be sued in court. That's why it is a juridical necessity. Kailangan siya. Maraming mga obligations na walang juridical necessity, right? Your obligation to compliment your neighbor, your obligation to uh, to say hi to your friends, those are not juridical necessities. Pag hindi ka nag-hi sa friend mo, hindi ka pwede kasuhan. It may be nice to do that, but that is not an obligation under the auspices of civil law. All right? So we have to differentiate here we have to talk about the difference between civil obligations and natural obligations. So in civil obligations, it gives the creditor or obligee the right to enforce performance. For natural obligations, it is based on equity and natural law. There is no right of action. So ang civil obligation, kapag umutang ka, kailangan mo bayaran. All right? You have the obligation to pay taxes. All right? Yung natural obligation naman, you have a natural obligation to say po and opo to your parents. You have the obligation to take care of your girlfriend. You have the natural obligation to give flowers. Pero pag hindi ka nag-flowers, pwede ka ba kasuhan? Hindi. Alright? So ito, mga natural obligations lang. Ang civil obligations, ito yung mga bagay na kailangan mo gawin kasi kung hindi, pwede kang kasuhan. So yon ang civil obligations. So what are the essential requisites of an obligation? So we have a passive subject, an active subject, the object or prestation, and a juridical or legal tie. So what is a passive subject, class? Pag sinabi natin passive, ano ba to? Di ba ang passive yung walang ginagawa? Passive, no? You're a passive person. So sino ang passive subject? Ang passive subject is the debtor. Alright? Bakit passive subject ang isang debtor? Di ba siya yung magbabayad? And that may be true, no? Pero ang debtor, passive subject yan kasi siya yung kakasuhan if he or she fails to perform his or her obligations. Now, number two, who is the active subject? The active subject is the creditor. Ang creditor, yung naniningil, yung nagpautang, no? Again, class, no, let's disabuse our minds. Huwag natin ilimit yung isip natin na ang obligation ay utang lang. Maraming iba't ibang klase ng civil obligations. We will learn all throughout this course. Kaya puro utang ang example natin because it's the easiest example. Alright? So yung active subject, yung creditor, kasi siya yung kailangan may gawin. Siya yung kailangan magsampa ng kaso sa korte, siya yung kailangan magsampa ng kaso sa barangay and the proper courts of law, etc. No? Number three, object or prestation. Ang object or prestation, ito yung bagay na, ito yung obligation mismo. If the obligation is to pay, then the payment. The payment of the thing is the object. The payment of money is the object. If the obligation is to deliver food, right? Food is the object. The delivery of the food is the object or prestation. Ang juridical or legal tie, this is the why, no? Why, WHY. Ito yung kung bakit ka mag-e-enter sa contract na to. All right? So, number 4, juridical or legal tie. Ito yung bakit ka nag-enter sa contract, no? In a contract of sale, no? In a contract of sale, pag ikaw yung seller, no? If you are the seller, all right? What is the object? If you are the seller, the object is the thing that you are selling. Ngayon, bakit ka mag-enter? Bakit mo i-deliver yung object na yon? Because kung seller ka, ano bang gusto mo? Bakit ka mag-deliver ng object? Gusto mo ng pera. Alright? So the legal tie there is your desire for money. Alright? So that is the juridical or legal tie. That's in a contract of sale, no? Pero in all obligations, apat palagi to na requisites. So here, no, let's discuss them one by one again. So a passive subject, this is also called the debtor or obligor. This is the person bound to the fulfillment of the obligation. This is the person who has the duty to give, to do, or not to do. Again, class, no? Passive subject, yung debtor. Siya yung merong obligation to give, to do, or not to do. Yung sa to give, kasama dito yung payment of money. Alright? Meron ding obligation to do. Like, let's say, carpenter ka. Tapos ang obligation mo is to build the house of the creditor. Or meron ding obligation not to do. Merong ganyan. Yung huwag ka magtatayo ng mataas na fence sa may bakod mo. That's an obligation not to do. Then we have an active subject, who is also called the creditor or obligee. This is the person entitled to demand fulfillment. This is the person who has a right to demand. So yan yung active subject, no? The object or prestation, this is the subject matter of the obligation. This is the conduct required to be observed by the debtor to give, to do, or not to do. In reciprocal obligations, the parties are reciprocally debtors and creditors of each other. So ano ba example ng reciprocal obligation? Contract of sale, no? Yung buyer, kung ikaw yung buyer sa palengke, ano yung obligation mo? To give money. At the same time, creditor ka rin kasi kukunin mo yung binibili mo. Right? Dapat ibigay sa'yo yun. Kung ikaw naman yung seller, ano yung obligation mo? Your obligation is to deliver what you are selling. Your obligation is to deliver the thing. But now as creditor, you are entitled to be paid money. No? So yan ang reciprocal obligation. You are both debtors and creditors of each other. So a perfect example of that is a contract of sale. Juridical or legal tie, this is also called the efficient clause. It binds or connects the parties to the obligation. Okay. So forms of obligations. Dapat ba ang obligation, dapat ba written to palagi? The answer is no. So this is the manner in which the obligation is manifested. It may be oral or in writing. Okay? So kahit wala kayong kasulatan, pwedeng magkaroon ka pa rin ng obligation, lalo na if it's provided for by law. Under the law, you are obliged to pay taxes on time. That is provided for by law. If kumikita ka and everything, hindi mo pwedeng sabihin na, teka, hindi ako magbabayad ng taxes. Hindi pwede, makukulong ka. You will be labeled a tax evader. No? So what are the kinds of obligations? Number one is a real obligation. Anong sabihin ng real obligation? A real obligation is an obligation to give. Right? Ano examples niyan? Example to give a fruit basket, example to give obligation to give a fruit basket, obligation to deliver 10 sacks of rice. Those are real obligations. Okay? Because you are giving something. Kasama dyan yung payment of money. No? That's a real obligation. Now, what is a personal obligation? A personal obligation is an obligation to do or not to do. Ngayon, dalawang klase ng personal obligation. No? We have the positive personal obligation, which is obligation to do or render service. Sabihin, obligation mo na may gawin ka. Let's say, obligation to paint the house of your client, obligation to provide litigation services to your client. That's a positive personal obligation. Okay? Now, what is a negative personal obligation? Obligation not to do. Pwede example yan, obligation not to sell, no? Not to sell your property, provided that pumayag ka dun sa kausap mo na hindi mo ibebenta yung property in a span of 5 years. That's an obligation not to do. Basta yung obligation mo na hindi mo gagawin yung bagay na yun. That's a negative personal obligation. What are the sources of obligations? My mnemonic here, class, is LCQAQ, LCCAC, no? That's what I used throughout my accountancy years in college and throughout my law school. By the way, class, huwag niyong baliwalain tong oblicon. Alright? Obligation is the foundation course for all business law subjects. If you fail this course, supposedly hindi ka makaka-take ng ibang courses, no? Or pag nasa law school kayo, if you fail oblicon, automatic, well, in some cases na habol, but more often than not, you will have to repeat one entire year. You have to add 1 year to your stay at law school, no? Pag binagsak mo yung oblicon, kasi marami ang requisites. So please take this seriously. So what are the sources of obligations? Number one, we have law. All right. So pag sinabing law, the law provides for the obligation, for the obligations itself, no? Like payment to pay, obligation to pay taxes. That's an obligation provided for by law. Obligation to take care of your children. That is provided for by law. Kung hindi mo inalagaan ng anak mo, pwede ka makasuhan. All right? So you have an obligation to take care of your children. Number three, number two. Number two is contracts. Contracts, right? It's one of the sources of an obligation. So pag may napag-usapan kayo, when two or more persons enter into a contract, they are obliged to perform their obligations, provided that that those obligations are lawful and provided the contract itself is lawful. All right? Kasi kung may kontrata kayo na magbebenta ka ng illegal drugs, that's a void contract, no? Hindi mo pwede i-fulfill yung obligation na yun. Hindi ka pwede kasuhan doon. But if your obligation, let's say, is that you exchange your book, you agree to exchange your book in exchange for a bottle of wine, that's a valid obligation. So you are obliged to, each party is obliged to fulfill his or her obligation. Pag hindi, pwede ka kasuhan. No, syempre marami pang matters dyan, but I'm just giving you the run through. All right? So ang contracts, no, it's one of the sources of an obligation. Can a single person enter into a contract by himself, na siya lang? Can a single person enter a contract with himself alone? That's not possible. All right? So ang contracts, no, two or more persons. All right? We will tackle contracts more later on. Number three, we have quasi-contracts. So there's a word here, quasi. What does quasi mean? Quasi means, in a Tagalog translation, it means parang. No? Parang contracts ang quasi-contracts. So what makes it different from a regular contract? All right? Ang quasi-contract, ang missing dyan is consent. All right? So dalawa yan, no? We will tackle that later on. Merong solution indemnity and negotiarum hestio. But example niyan. Let's say nasusunog yung bahay ng kapitbahay mo. Walang tao dun sa bahay niya kasi let's say nagbakasyon sila. Alright? Nagbakasyon sila, let's say sa Baguio. Tapos walang tao yung bahay, walang tao dun sa bahay pero nasusunog. So ikaw bilang mabuting kapitbahay, ang ginawa mo, gumastos ka. Nagtawag ka ng fire truck, gumastos ka ng tubig, etc. Let's say gumastos ka ng mga around 15,000 pesos para masalvage yung para masagip yung bahay. Okay? Tapos ngayon bumalik yung kapitbahay mo. Tapos syempre, nagastusan ka ng 15,000. Do you think you can ask for reimbursement of that cost of 15,000 pesos? Tapos sinabi ng kapitbahay mo, teka, bakit kita pabayaran? Pumayag ba ako na sagipin mo yung bahay ko? Class, the answer there is yes. Pwede mo singilin yung 15,000 pesos. Alright? Because the essence of a quasi-contract is the prevention of unjust enrichment. Alright? Hindi pwede magkaroon ng unjust enrichment at the expense of other people. So parang nakakaroon ka ng na-enrich ka to the detriment of others. No? So yan, quasi-contract. Pwede ka kasuhan, no? I mean, pwede mo kasuhan yung kapitbahay mo kapag ayaw kanyang bayaran dun sa nagastos mo. Alright? That's yung example na binigay ko, that's an example of negotiorum hestio. Alright? It's the voluntary management of affairs of another. Then we have acts or omissions punishable by law. So ito yung mga, let's say nagnakaw ka, or let's say you committed estafa. Okay? So let's say that's a crime, right? You are still obliged to return what you have stolen or what you have appropriated for yourself, no? So obligation mong ibalik 'yan. So number 4, crimes yung mga yan, no? Acts or omissions punishable by law, such as theft, estafa, etc. Number 5 is quasi-delicts. Quasi-delicts are torts. In English law, they are called torts, no? Ang quasi-delicts, ito yung a perfect example niyan. Let's say naglagay ka ng paso, no? Let's say nakatira ka sa 3rd floor. Naglagay ka ng paso sa may bintana. Nahulog, no? Nahulog kasi medyo careless yung pagkalagay mo. Tapos nahulog yung paso. May tinamaan na tao sa kalye, no? Are you obliged to pay for medical expenses? Yes, you are. All right? So anong difference dun sa number 4 sa crimes, no? Sa crimes, intentional. Sa quasi-delicts, this is unintentional. All right? Pero meron kang negligence. Ano ba example niyan? Marami. Let's say, mabilis ka magpatakbo ng motor mo o ng kotse mo. Maaring hindi mo sinasadya na banggain yung kotse o yung tao, no? That can be a quasi-delict. Pero ngayon kasi, it's now a crime also. It's called reckless imprudence. Kung may napatay ka, edi reckless imprudence resulting to homicide. Kung may nasugatan ka, edi reckless imprudence resulting to physical injuries depending on the severity. It can be less serious. It can be serious physical injuries, less serious, or slight physical injuries. Pag nabangga mo lang yung kotse, that's reckless imprudence resulting to damage to property. So, a perfect example ng quasi-delicts is yun, yung paso. No? Kasi naging negligent ka. Bakit mo doon nilagay? May nabagsakan ka tuloy. So, that's a quasi-delict. So, law, no? Sources of obligations, where the obligation is imposed by law itself, such as obligation to pay taxes, obligation to support one's family, right? Contracts, from agreement and stipulation of the parties. So the parties are free to stipulate anything as long as it's legal. All right? Pwede mo ba ibenta yung girlfriend mo or yung boyfriend mo? Syempre hindi. That's human trafficking. Okay? Pwede mo ba ibenta yung used clothes mo? Pwede. There's nothing wrong with that. Examples, obligation to repay a loan, obligation to deliver a purchased item. quasi-contract. It is similar to a contract, but agreement between parties is not present. It is resulting from unilateral acts which are lawful and voluntary, and this is to prevent unjust enrichment. So yung example ko kanina, obligation to reimburse the neighbor who put out the fire in your house while you are away. So you have an obligation to return the money. Also, this is another example of quasi-contract, no? Obligation to return money paid by mistake. All right? I personally experienced this class, no? I received in my GCash the amount of 3,000 pesos. So napapaisip ako, no? After I received a message na may nag-transfer sa akin. Wala naman akong transaction during that time, no? Wala naman akong ginawang consultation or whatever. So after 5 minutes, tinawagan ako ng tao. The person realized his mistake, no? Kasi namali yung digits dun sa number. Parang nagkabaliktad lang ng isang number, no? Tapos sa akin nakapadala. No? Of course, class, I returned that amount, no? I returned that amount not just because it is the right thing to do, but it is the legal thing to do. Pag hindi ko ginawa yun, pwede niya akong kasuhan, no? Of course, kung alam niya yung address ko, etc. and everything, no? But syempre, hindi ko na papaabutin sa ganun, di ba? Alright? So ganun class. So pag may nagkamali magbayad sa inyo or nagkamali kayo magbayad, okay? That other person has to return the money. Okay? Paano kapag may mga nagsasabi, di ba dahil pabaya siya, so lost niya yun? Kaya ang nagiging norm tuloy class, no? Ang nagiging norm tuloy, parang ini-invite sa radio station, sa iba't ibang TV stations, yung mga taxi driver na nagsoli ng pera, etc. Which is actually commendable. Maganda rin yun. It is to encourage good behavior. Pero kasi, kung magkakaso ka naman, mahirap din kasi hindi mo alam yung address ng taong yun, etc. No? But the thing is, you are really obliged to return the money that was paid to you by mistake. Hindi mo yan pwedeng angkinin. Alright? So that is a quasi-contract class, no? So acts or omissions punished by law. So these are delicts or crimes, no? So kanina merong quasi-delict. Sabi ng quasi-delict, hindi parang delict or parang crime, no? So on crimes, these are arising from civil liabilities which are consequences of criminal offenses. Examples of these are the obligation of the thief to return the object stolen by him, obligation of accused to indemnify the victim in physical injuries. All right? So kapag nakasuhan yung nabugbog, he has to pay for the hospital expenses as well kung meron man. Quasi-delicts or torts, those arising from damages caused to another, there being fault or negligence. There is no contractual relation between the parties. Importante ito sa quasi-delict, no? So, example ito, obligation of building owner to pay damages suffered by pedestrian from falling pots or things placed on window ledges. Kasi masyadong pabaya yun. There's a high chance na talagang babagsak yun. So, quasi-contractual obligations. These are juridical relations resulting from lawful, voluntary, and unilateral acts by virtue of which the parties become bound to each other to the end that no one will be unjustly enriched or benefited at the expense of another. So nakailang ulit na tayo sa quasi-contracts, no? Pero pabalik-balikan natin. So this is not a contract, but the law deems it one in order to prevent unjust enrichment. There is no consent at all, but the law considers the parties to have entered into a contract. What are the kinds of quasi-contracts? So we have negotiorum hestio. Ito yung sa fire, no? Yung you put out the fire in your neighbor's house. So gumastos ka. So you are entitled to be reimbursed. So that is negotiorum hestio. Number 2 is solutio indebiti. That is payment by mistake. So yan, no? Negotiorum hestio. Voluntary management of the property or affairs of another This is without knowledge or consent of the latter. So examples, neighbor put out the fires of your home while you were away and your neighbor incurs expenses. So you have to pay that person who put out the fire for you. No? Yung kapitbahay mo, yung habang wala ka. Solution indemnity, this is payment by mistake. There is no right to receive the thing delivered. The thing was delivered through mistake. All right. Quasi-delicts or torts. Acts or omissions by a person which causes damage to another. There being fault or negligence. So class, yung fault or negligence, this is important, no? Kasi what if yung sa pasongan, no? Let's say maayos naman yung pagkalagay mo. Eh dahil merong bagyo, nilipad yung paso, tapos meron tinamaan tao sa labas. Are you still liable? What do you think? The answer is no. All right? Because that's already a fortuitous event. It's something that you have no control on. It's something that you could not have foreseen. Kasi itong paso na nilagay mo sa ledge, this can be foreseen eh. Foreseen mo to na pwedeng mahulog. May mga tao mayabang, hindi mo hulog yan. And nahulog nga. Pabaya ka pa rin. There is no pre-existing contractual relation between the parties. So what are the requisites of a quasi-delict? There must be an act or omission. There must be fault or negligence. There must be damage caused. There must be a direct relation or connection of cause and effect between the act or omission and the damage. And there is no existing contractual relation between the parties. Okay, class, we end chapter 1 here. Good day.